The courtroom was silent. The prosecution had laid out their case, and the jury's expressions were cold, unreadable. Aaliyah Johnson sat at the defendant's table, her hands clenched tightly together. Her future was at stake, and everything pointed to a guilty verdict. Across the room, Officer Daniel Murphy smirked, arms crossed confidently. He had lied under oath, fabricated evidence, and convinced the jury that Aaliyah was a criminal. Her mother, Deborah, sat frozen in fear. Everyone knew how these cases usually ended. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, Aaliyah's defense attorney stood up. "Your Honor, the defense has new evidence," he said, "and it's about to change everything." What happened next shocked the entire courtroom. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from, and if you believe in justice, hit that subscribe button. Aaliyah's heart pounded as she turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of Officer Murphy's smirk, the same smug expression he had worn when he dragged her out of her school in handcuffs. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to break. Her defense attorney, Marcus Williams, stood tall beside her, preparing to reveal the evidence that could change everything. But before we get to that moment, let's go back to how this all started. Aaliyah Johnson had never been in trouble before. A 17-year-old honors student with dreams of becoming a lawyer. Raised by her single mother, Deborah, a nurse who worked long hours to give her daughter a better life. Loved debate club, history, and standing up for what was right. Never missed a day of school, never got detention, never even had a parking ticket. But in Officer Murphy's eyes, none of that mattered. To him, she was just another black teen in the wrong place at the wrong time. Officer Murphy had been on the force for 15 years, a decorated officer with a long history of successful arrests, known for being aggressive in black communities. Believed that getting convictions mattered more than the truth. Had a record of profiling young black teens, but had never been caught. When a local convenience store was robbed, Murphy saw a perfect opportunity. No real evidence, no problem. He just needed someone to blame, and unfortunately for Aaliyah, she was the easiest target. Location: outside Jefferson High School, 2 weeks before the trial. Aaliyah had just finished basketball practice. The sun was setting, the parking lot mostly empty. She was walking toward the bus stop when red and blue lights flashed behind her. A police car skidded to a stop. Before she could react, Officer Murphy jumped out. "Aaliyah Johnson, hands where I can see them." Confused, she froze. "What?" Murphy grabbed her wrist, pulling it behind her back. "You're under arrest for robbery and resisting arrest." Robbery? Resisting arrest? She hadn't even moved. Bystanders gasped as Aaliyah was shoved against the police car. Her classmates watched in shock. Her mother got the call while working a night shift, her worst nightmare coming true. And just like that, her life was flipped upside down. Now, sitting in the courtroom, she was fighting to prove her innocence. The question was, would the truth be enough? Aaliyah sat still in her seat, her heart pounding. The courtroom felt cold, almost suffocating. The weight of every lie that had been told about her pressed against her chest. She stole a glance at Officer Murphy, who sat across the room with a confident smirk. He had no doubt that his plan was working. Her mother, Deborah Johnson, sat right behind her, eyes filled with fear and frustration. The whole case felt rigged from the start. And the worst part, the jury seemed to believe it. 2 weeks ago, Aaliyah had been arrested right outside her school, dragged away in front of her classmates. Murphy claimed she had robbed a convenience store near her school, resisted arrest when he approached her, matched the suspect description perfectly. But here was the problem. Aaliyah had never been near that store. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing tied her to the crime. The store's security footage was missing. Still, the prosecution had one key piece of evidence. The stolen items were found in her backpack, or at least that's what Murphy claimed. The memory of that night was burned into her mind. She had been forced into a cold holding cell. She had to sit there for hours, waiting for her mother. When she tried to explain her innocence, no one listened. Murphy had walked past her cell, grinning. "You should have thought twice before stealing," he said. Aaliyah had gritted her teeth, refusing to cry. But deep down, she was terrified. Now, in court, the prosecution presented their case with confidence. Linda Hayes, the state prosecutor, stood up, heels clicking against the floor as she approached the jury. "This case is simple," she said. The defendant was caught with stolen items in her bag. Officer Murphy, a decorated officer, apprehended her lawfully. The evidence is clear. She turned, pointing at Aaliyah. This young woman, though she may look innocent, is not. Then came Murphy's turn to speak. He walked to the stand with fake humility. "I was patrolling near Jefferson High," he began, "when I spotted the suspect near the crime scene. She looked nervous, suspicious." Lies. "After a routine search, I found the stolen goods in her backpack. She became hostile, trying to run. I had no choice but to arrest her." More lies. Aaliyah's fists clenched under the table. She wanted to scream, but she stayed quiet because she knew something no one else in that room did. Marcus Williams, her defense attorney, stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Officer Murphy," he said smoothly, "are you absolutely sure about that testimony?" Murphy chuckled. "Of course. I'm an officer of the law." Marcus smirked. "Interesting," he said, "because we have new evidence that proves you're lying." The courtroom fell silent. Murphy's smirk disappeared, and for the first time he looked nervous. The entire courtroom fell silent. Officer Murphy's smirk wavered. He shifted in his seat, but he tried to maintain his composure. Marcus Williams, Aaliyah's defense attorney, stepped forward confidently. He had him now. "Officer Murphy," he said, his voice sharp but calm, "you swore under oath that you found stolen goods in Aaliyah Johnson's backpack, correct?" Murphy folded his arms. "That's right." Marcus nodded, flipping through his papers. "And you also testified that security footage from the convenience store was unavailable. Is that also correct?" Murphy raised an eyebrow. "Yes. Unfortunately, the footage was lost due to a system error." Marcus smirked. "That's interesting." Because right at that moment, Aaliyah's defense team turned on a projector screen, and there it was. The convenience store's security footage, fully intact. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the video began to play. The jury, the judge, and even the prosecutor leaned in. The real thief was on the screen, a man in a dark hoodie, at least 6 feet tall. Aaliyah wasn't in the store. Not even once. The timestamp proved she was in school at the time of the crime. Murphy's face turned pale. Aaliyah's mother covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The entire courtroom was in shock. Marcus turned back to Murphy. "So, officer, would you like to explain why you arrested an innocent girl?" Murphy gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles white. I must have made a mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A mistake?" He turned to the jury. Aaliyah Johnson was dragged out of school, handcuffed, and thrown in jail. She was humiliated, treated like a criminal. And now, this officer wants to call it a mistake. The jury members exchanged looks, anger flashing in their eyes. Murphy shifted uncomfortably. "The items were found in her bag, that's undeniable." Marcus smirked again. "Really?" He turned to his assistant. "Play the next video." A second video appeared on the screen. This time, it was body cam footage from Murphy himself. The footage showed Murphy searching Aaliyah's bag. The bag was completely empty. No stolen items. Then Murphy was seen pulling something out of his pocket. items that matched the ones reported stolen. The entire courtroom gasped. Murphy's career was over. The prosecutor, Linda Hayes, looked furious. "Your Honor," she said, standing up, "I was not made aware of this footage." Judge Carter narrowed his eyes at Murphy. "Officer Murphy, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Murphy's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The judge's voice was cold. "Officer Murphy, I'm holding you in contempt of court. You are under investigation for perjury and evidence tampering. Bailiff, remove him from the stand." Two officers stepped forward, grabbing Murphy by the arms. His face was red with rage. "You don't understand," he sputtered. "She looked guilty. They always do." The courtroom erupted in outrage. Murphy had just admitted his bias. His last excuse had sealed his fate. Judge Carter turned to the jury. "I think we've seen enough. The prosecution's case is built on lies. The defendant, Aaliyah Johnson, is hereby found not guilty. Case dismissed." Aaliyah felt her breath catch. She had won. Her mother let out a sob of relief, pulling her into a tight hug. Marcus Williams smiled down at her. "I told you, the truth always wins." Aaliyah smiled back. For the first time since this nightmare started, she finally felt free. As Murphy was led out in handcuffs, reporters and cameras swarmed him. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his power. An investigation was launched into his previous arrests. Other victims came forward, sharing similar stories. He had thought he was untouchable. But in the end, the truth caught up to him. As Aaliyah and her mother walked out of the courtroom, the sun felt warmer than before. Her mother turned to her. "What now, baby?" Aaliyah took a deep breath. I want to be a lawyer." Her mother's eyes filled with pride. And as Aaliyah walked toward her future, she knew one thing. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. As Aaliyah and her mother stepped out of the courthouse, the sun felt warmer, brighter. It was over. She had won. For the first time in weeks, she took a deep breath that didn't feel heavy. But just as she was about to step into the car, her lawyer, Marcus Williams, called her back. "Aaliyah, wait," he said, his expression serious. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Marcus glanced at her mother before handing Aaliyah a file. "There's something you need to see." Aaliyah opened the file with shaky hands. Inside were dozens of reports. Names of other black teens Murphy had arrested over the years. Similar charges, same missing evidence. Cases where the defendants had no real defense and were convicted. Aaliyah's stomach twisted. "These are all—" Marcus nodded. "They were framed, just like you." Aaliyah felt sick. She had almost been another name on that list. But what about the ones who didn't get justice? What about the kids who were sitting in jail right now because of Murphy's lies? Aaliyah looked up at Marcus, determination burning in her eyes. "What happens to them?" she asked. Marcus sighed. "With Murphy exposed, some of these cases can be reopened. But it's not easy. Some of them don't have the resources or legal teams to fight back." Aaliyah's fists clenched. That wasn't fair. She had been lucky. But luck shouldn't be the reason someone gets justice. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. "Baby, you did your part. You're free now." But Aaliyah shook her head. "Not until they are too." Her mother looked at her, searching her face. Then slowly, she smiled. Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, you might just make a great lawyer one day." Aaliyah grinned. "I will." And in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just her fight anymore. She had been given a second chance. And now, she was going to make sure others got theirs too. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Officer Murphy sat alone in an interrogation room. His badges had been stripped. His career was over. He was facing charges for perjury and evidence tampering. The door opened, and the same prosecutor who had once defended him, Linda Hayes, walked in. She sat down, dropping a thick file on the table. "These are the cases you lied about," she said coldly. "We're reopening every single one." Murphy's face hardened. "You're really going to throw me under the bus?" Linda leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You did this to yourself." Murphy clenched his fists. For years, he had controlled people's fates. Now, he had no control at all. For the first time, he felt exactly what his victims had felt. Powerless. The next morning, Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through article after article about Murphy's downfall. News outlets were exposing his history of racial profiling. Activists were demanding reform in the justice system. Former victims were speaking out, sharing their stories. Aaliyah looked over at her mother, who was reading one of the articles. "You did this," Deborah said softly. "You fought back, and you won." Aaliyah smiled slightly. But she knew the fight was far from over, because for every Murphy that got caught, there were more, just like him, still in power. She wasn't going to let that slide. Not ever. Later that night, she picked up a notebook and started writing down names. Kids who were wrongfully arrested. Lawyers who could help them. Steps she could take to make sure this never happened again. Her mother walked in and saw what she was doing. "Aaliyah, what are you doing?" Aaliyah looked up, her expression firm. "I'm getting started." Her mother stared at her for a moment, then smiled. And as Aaliyah closed the notebook, she knew. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Aaliyah closed her notebook, her mind racing. She had spent the entire night researching, listing names of people who had been wrongfully convicted, people who, like her, had no voice in the system. She knew she was just one person, but she also knew change starts somewhere. Her mother walked into the room holding 2 cups of coffee. She set one down in front of Aaliyah. "Still up?" Aaliyah rubbed her tired eyes but nodded. "I can't stop thinking about them," she admitted. "All those kids who never got a fair chance." Her mother sighed, sitting down across from her. "I know, baby." Aaliyah looked at her with determination. "I need to do something about it." Her mother smiled knowingly. "Then do it." And just like that, her path became clear. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Daniel Murphy sat in a jail cell. His career was over. His fellow officers turned their backs on him. His name was now all over the news, for all the wrong reasons. A lawyer entered the room, setting a file down. "You're looking at multiple counts of perjury, evidence tampering, and wrongful arrests," the man said. Murphy stared ahead, silent. "You could face 20 years in prison," the lawyer continued. Murphy clenched his fists. He had spent his life putting people behind bars. Now, he was the one in the cage. No way out. No second chances. Back at home, Aaliyah's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. News outlets were calling her a symbol of justice. Activists were using her case to demand police reform. Other victims were reaching out, sharing their own stories. Aaliyah scrolled through the messages, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. So many people had suffered just like her. Now, she had the platform to do something about it. A few days later, she received a call that changed everything. Marcus Williams, her lawyer, had set up a meeting with a local university. She walked into the office, her heart pounding. The dean, a woman in her 50s, smiled warmly. "Aaliyah, we've been following your story. We're impressed by your strength, your intelligence, and your fight for justice." Aaliyah nodded nervously. "Thank you." The dean slid a letter across the desk. Aaliyah picked it up with shaky hands. As she read the words, her eyes widened. A full scholarship to study law. A mentorship with top civil rights attorneys. A chance to fight for justice, legally. Aaliyah looked up, speechless. "This isn't just because of what you went through," the dean said. "It's because of what you're going to do next." Aaliyah felt tears in her eyes. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. 1 year later, Aaliyah sat in a small law office, surrounded by case files. She wasn't a lawyer yet, but she was already helping other teens like her, writing letters to judges, helping lawyers find wrongful convictions, organizing legal aid for kids who couldn't afford defense. Her fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Meanwhile, Murphy was escorted into a courtroom, this time as a defendant. His lawyer leaned over. "Any final words?" Murphy glanced at Aaliyah, who was sitting in the audience. She met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. Murphy sighed, looking away. I was wrong. It didn't matter now. His sentence was set. And justice, it had finally won. Aaliyah walked out of the courthouse feeling the sun on her face. Her mother hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you," Aaliyah smiled. She had cleared her name. She had taken down a corrupt officer. And now, she was going to change the system from the inside, because no one deserved to go through what she had. And as long as she had a voice, she was going to use it. As Aaliyah and her mother stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of everything that had happened finally lifted. For the first time in months, she felt free. The past couldn't be erased, but it had led her to something greater. She had walked into that courtroom as a victim. She walked out as a fighter. This story isn't just about Aaliyah. It's about every innocent person who has been wrongfully accused. It's about standing up when the system tries to silence you. And most of all, it's about fighting for justice, even when the odds are against you. Because in the end, the truth will always win. What do you think? Should officers who lie under oath face the same sentences as those they try to frame? How can we make sure this never happens again? Let's talk in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you believe in justice, truth, and standing up for what's right, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because these stories, they need to be told. See you in the next one.